Welcome to Shaka Extra Time, a show appearing only here on Facebook Live and the only place where Shaka answers your questions. How are you today?
Usually terrific, Ian. It's nice to see you again.
Really glad to be here again with you. Now, the big news this week is in the U.S. President Donald Trump removed the White House communication director, Anthony Scaramucci, just 10 days after he was hired. What's your perspective on that?
It is very interesting because people thought that Scaramucci was a very, very powerful individual. In fact, he himself had said that he would be reporting directly to President Trump, not going through a chief of staff or any other person. So he seemed to have, at least according to what I have heard, a very, very close relationship with the president. But you know what? In politics, my friend, sometimes a day, in fact, is eternity. The man is now history because the new chief of staff, General John Kelly, I gather that one of his conditions in order to accept to take up that job of chief of staff was, in fact, to make sure that that individual Scaramucci is out of the White House. And it happened.
What's your take on the Trump White House? There's been a lot of talk about what's going on there. First of all, has he gotten anything done policy-wise? And then with all, the smoke going on, how have you been witnessing his White House as it unfolds?
First of all, as you asked quite rightly so, has he in fact achieved that much? Obviously, when you think about the fact that he has actually been in the White House for slightly more than 6 months, when you compare and contrast with his predecessors, he really hasn't achieved much. He only recently, of course, you know that he failed, for example, to repeal the Obamacare. Initially, it was repeal and replace. That one actually he failed. And then he said, okay, I think we can only repeal it
and replace
it later. But guess what? There was a Senator, John McCain, a Republican, a man, of course, who is considered to be a war hero. He cast the vote that made all the difference.
He not only cast a vote, but he came back after a cancer diagnosis to cast a vote.
That is very, very, very true. And he really felt that that bill was not really something that he would support because there are a lot of Americans, by the way, who do not have health care insurance, and people who, for whatever reason, feel that, at least for now, they are reasonably okay with Obamacare. Unless, of course, you come up with something, frankly, that improves upon the Obamacare. I don't know what has happened because during, I think, immediately after the elections, President Trump actually said that he was going for a sort of universal health care. Maybe he should actually go for that. But you know what? What you need is a bipartisan sort of bill on Capitol Hill, really. If you think about the fact that the Democrats are very consistently together. They are not going to allow something to happen unless if it is something they feel that is a reflection of the interests or concerns of their constituents. So I think what is needed really is the Republicans to work together with the Democrats so that they come up with a bill that is acceptable to the people of the United States of America.
So then let's talk about Trump's State Department. So far at the State Department, top Africa officials have not been assigned yet. I've spoken to experts who have said this is a big problem. There's a lot going on in Africa right now, and we don't have the special envoy for Sudan and South Sudan, for example, has yet to be appointed. What's your take on that?
That is very true, and it is also equally true, frankly, to a lot of other, parts of the world. Again, when you think about making appointments, when you compare and contrast him with his predecessors, there's no question again that he's very, very much behind. I know, for example, the man who is actually rumored to be the next Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs. He's a man that if I mentioned his name, you would actually recognize because he has been on Straight Talk Africa several times. He's someone that has told me he has already been cleared, vetted, and what have you. What remains is for him to go to Capitol Hill so that he can be vetted by the Senate.
Can you share that name with us?
No, I don't think that it would be appropriate, honestly.
Okay, no problem. I understand. I had to try. I am a reporter. Now, let's go back to the White House. In particular, let's talk about John Kelly, who you mentioned earlier. He's the new communications director. He's a former four-star Marine general.
He's not the communications director. He is the chief of staff.
The chief of staff.
Effectively, frankly, the number 2 man in the White House. Or in the country for that matter. This is a man who is supposed to be the gatekeeper to POTUS, the President of the United States.
Do you think he's a good fit for the White House?
Oh, he obviously, when you think about his track record, this is a very highly respectable individual. He was a very, very successful, brass of the Pentagon. He retired after after several decades at the White House, at the Pentagon. He was in charge of the Marines. And only most recently, by the way, Ayen, he was in fact the cabinet secretary in charge of Homeland Security. And according to President Trump, he has done an incredibly tremendous job. So he actually expects that he will do even much better, to the extent that, in fact, that he said, I can see General John Kelly being the best individual that has ever occupied that position. The only problem is that there was also another general in the history of the United States that occupied that position, and it was General Alexander Haig. He was actually chief of staff for President Richard Nixon, and of course, the rest is history. You're talking about Watergate and what have you. The rest is history. Who knows? Are there comparisons, perhaps, between the Richard Nixon second-term administration and the one of President Trump first-term administration? I don't know.
Well, that is very interesting. We'll be keeping a close eye on that, I'm sure. Well, let's go to the lifeline of our show, our Facebook followers. Let's start with the question from Mohindo Brian. He is from Uganda, and he wants to know what is the inevitability. I can't say that word.
Inevitability?
Yes, that is right. I can't say that word. Of bloodshed in Kenya's politics. I think our Facebook follower is asking whether there will be violence during the upcoming elections in Kenya, which we'll talk about in depth tomorrow. What do you think about that?
I really don't know why people should be very much concerned about the possibility of violence in Kenya, because it happened back in 2008. And it happened in 2008 because the then Electoral Commission of Kenya had done a very poor job. For example, the main opposition figure, Raila Amolo Odinga, according to some of the results that were being disseminated at the time, he was actually very far ahead of then incumbent President Mwai Kibaki. And guess what? At some point, the Electoral Commission stopped counting and stopped sharing the results. And then several hours later, they simply came up with a ballpark figure that put President Kibaki ahead. And he retained, of course, the presidency. And people did not believe anything. So they basically went to the streets and all that kind of stuff. So I think that if, for example, the Independent Electoral Boundaries Commission does exactly what is expected to do, frankly, I don't think there should be any problem. And the example of 2007 is very accurate because I had the privilege and honor of actually having lunch at the Nairobi Intercontinental Hotel with a man who had actually been the chairman of the Electoral Commission of Kenya, a man called Samuel Kivuitu, a man who had incredible, impeccable credentials. And he told me the election was stolen. And it's not only that, you actually had, not a long time ago, there was a hearing in the Kenyan Senate, and a gentleman who happens to own the Royal Media, which is one of the most influential television and radio stations in Kenya, a man called S.K. Macharia, a friend of mine actually. He also testified openly that in 2008, Kibaki did not win the election. He stole it. Raila won the election, and he said he had all the evidence to boot. Incontrovertible evidence, not liable to falter. And of course, guess what? They ended up actually forming a sort of grand coalition, or a cohabitation sort of coalition, which retained President Kibaki as president, head of state, and also appointed Raila Amolo Odinga at that time as the prime minister, the chief coordinator of the today administration or governance of Kibaki's administration. Now, in 2013, yes, there were also problems. But guess what? You didn't see violence. As a matter of fact, Raila Odinga, there is also evidence that he may in fact have won that election. I have also been told by people who are in positions of actually knowing exactly what had happened. But you know what? He went for the judiciary option. And the Supreme Court of Kenya had the case. It was expected that it would come up with a very good verdict, because the Chief Justice was a very, very respected lawyer, individual, and person by the name Dr. William Mutunga. But guess what? They eventually dismissed the petition. People said, wait a minute, life goes on. So I honestly think that unless something very, very major, and probably something that the vast majority of Kenyans, frankly, do not accept, feel that it is unfair, that is injustice, and what have you, I don't see, frankly, any reason why people should be worried about whether or not you have violence in Kenya. Kenya is one of the most modern, developed nation states in Africa. It has one of the greatest numbers of people who are very highly educated, highly exposed. It's very highly urbanized. They have one of the most, probably one of the most incredibly, I think, important document called a constitution, which allows them, for example, to express themselves really. In Kenya, expressing yourself is not a privilege. It is the law enshrined under the constitution. You have at least some semblance, frankly, of checks and balances, where you have at least what appears to be an independent judiciary, an independent legislature, an independent executive. It's a place where, yes, the executive tries to kind of like take advantage of the history and the traditions of Kenya, but it seems to me that people have moved away from that, really. They just look at the fact that their rights have to prevail at the end of the day.
Speaking of self-expression, social media is obviously everyone's favorite way to express themselves. Social media has grown immensely since Kenya's last elections. So what role do you see Facebook, Twitter, Instagram playing this round of elections?
It is playing an incredible role, Ayen, because for one thing, the traditional media, we're talking about television, radio, and the print media, is largely controlled by, for example, people who actually support the status quo. We're talking about people who support Jubilee. For example, there are two major media institutions. One is called the media, the Nation Media Group. Yes, the majority share may be held by the Aga Khan, but frankly, most of their shareholders and even the people essentially who run the show, they are the people who tend to come from what they call Central Province. So they pretty much tend to be favorable to somebody who is in the State House, and that is, of course, Uhuru Kenyatta. And then there is another major media group. It is called the Standard Media Group. It is owned by former Kenyan President Daniel Arap Moi and some of his business associates. They also support the Jubilee government. Then you have Uhuru Kenyatta's family itself. It has K24 television. They have Radio Kameme and several others, and newspapers and stuff like that. And then you have SK Macharia, who controls Royal Media, and it has a very powerful, citizen television and all kind of stuff. I gather that he says he supports Raila Odinga, that he supports, for example, the opposition. But when you look at what appears on television and radio and look at some of the people that in fact work for that media organization, frankly, they don't simply, I mean, the kind like, it doesn't really kind of like add up. The argument doesn't add up. So because of the fact that you have the traditional media being controlled by supporters of the Jubilee party, I could also add Capital Radio, which is also very important, owned by Chris Kirubi, another incredible businessman who supports Jubilee. You could see that without, for example, the independence of the social media, we probably wouldn't hear much about what is happening in the opposition, and especially NASA, which is, of course, whose flag bearer, again, is former Kenyan Prime Minister Raila Amolo Odinga. So I think social media has played a role of bringing about some kind of reasonable balance, really.
That is very interesting. Well, still on the subject of elections, our friend Kelvin Smith from Liberia wants to know, how can we have free and fair elections in Africa without intervention from the West, thereby allowing Africans to make their own choices?
Yeah, but I don't think that we should worry very much probably about external factors, really, especially if, for example, we as Africans are united, if we as Africans know exactly what we want, and above and beyond sincerity, if we listen, for example, to the words of the late great preacher from the southern states of the United States, and that is the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther Jr., when he said, "Injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere." And I think that part of the problem, sometimes we look for scapegoats, is because we are incapable, or at least we don't try probably hard enough, frankly, to look ourselves in the mirror, to take a responsibility, to know that, you know what, the only way we can have a society that reflects its own people, a society that values humanity, that it is us who have to be willing to do that. Nobody is going to come from anywhere and frankly either teach you or make you a better person than the kind of power that you actually have in order to make sure that you are the person, for example, that respects yourself, And if you can respect yourself, you can respect your neighbor. In the process, you can respect your community, and you can respect even the larger society. And we can only do that if we believe in what some people call social, economic justice for all of us.
Absolutely. I agree with that 100%.
Mm-hmm.
So, Shaka, is the presidential system or the parliamentary system more suitable for Africa? That's a question from Frank Numawanya.
It is very interesting that Frank raises that interesting question. When most African countries, rather, who were under the British, when they became independent, they adopted the parliamentary system, because the British actually have a parliamentary system. The head of government in Britain is a prime minister who lives and functions out of number 10 Downing Street. And the head of state, that respect is reserved for the Queen, Her Majesty, of course, Queen Elizabeth II. But after 1 year, these countries became republics, and they said they did not want to be, for example, having a head of state who was a former colonizer who happened to be a queen. And they argued that they should become republicans. And for becoming a republican, then you look up to America and say, you have a president. But then they justify it by saying that you need one president, one country, one people. As if, in fact, just those three words simply, by uttering those words, you would actually be a united, country. That didn't quite help. The United States is probably successful, with the presidency, especially because it has three branches of government that happen to be equal in power in terms of checks and balances. You have, for example, a situation where the purse is controlled by Capitol Hill. It is the Congress that controls the money. The judiciary is independent. It cannot, frankly, be manipulated by 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the White House. And I think that until the Africans also figure out that power belongs to the people, and that those three branches of government really are supposed to be protecting, for example, the interests and concerns of the people who make up the sovereign and citizenship and all that kind of stuff, we are not going to go far. In fact, I remember recently, Senator John McCain was actually sending a message to President Donald Trump, saying that, Trump probably thinks that we are subordinates of his. The fact of the matter is he has to learn that we are equals. And I think that's really what happens, because you can bring about checks and balances and all kind of stuff. But in a situation where the current arrangement is good only in paper in most African countries, when the reality suggests that power actually is in the executive, and the other two branches, the judiciary and the legislature, are subordinate to the legislature. And even though money is in theory supposed to be controlled by the legislature, in practice it is controlled by a president. So it seems to me that at the end of the day, you need, first of all, a constitution, a working document that, first of all, people believe in, a document that the leaders, frankly, feel that they must protect. Because when you become a president, you swear, you put up your arm on, you raise a Bible or a Quran or something else, and you talk about protecting the Constitution. You talk about defending it, you talk about preserving it. But guess what? A lot of countries across the continent, they end up, in fact, changing the constitution so as to benefit from it both personally and politically. It shouldn't be like that. If you amend the constitution, that amendment should not be there to serve your personal or political interests. It should be able to be serving that president or that other leader that comes after you.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, people will call it something less than a constitution. And I know some people will call it, for example, a personal manifesto, not a constitution.
Absolutely. Before we run out of time, I want to get to two more questions. This next one is from Ola Simizi. He says, Zambia's main opposition leader, Hakainde Hichilema, detained for over 100 days over a motor vehicle incident involving President Lungu. Hakainde Hichilema has since been charged with treason. What is the reason? Well,
we have actually visited and revisited that issue, I think, in several forums, frankly, of Shaka Extra Time, and we talked about that also on Straight Talk Africa.
Yeah.
I think that given what we know, it seems to me, frankly, that Hichilema shouldn't actually be in a prison, shouldn't be charged with the treason, but that has happened. It is a fact. And President Edgar Lungu actually says that he has nothing really to do with that, because he says that the judiciary system of the Republic of Zambia is independent. He probably knows what he's talking about. After all, he's not only a politician, but a trained lawyer himself. But I hope that whatever he does or whatever the government does is in the interests of the vast majority of the Zambian people. To be honest with you, it is a very politically, I think, sensitive and hot subject. And I hope that at the end of the day, it will be resolved either politically or judicially, but probably politically, really.
Now, Shaka, I want to give you a chance to respond, because it seems like you have upset one of our Facebook followers, Tafira Ijara. He says, you always talk to influence neoliberal on Africa. We know that you are sent by the West. They give you some dollars. You talk much about African politics. Please stop your lying.
Very interesting. I think that's a very interesting criticism. But I have to say, frankly, that I am eminently underqualified for those charges that he lays out. Because at the end of the day, what guides me, by the way, are facts. They are facts and issues, not ideology, not propaganda. Whatever I say, frankly, is a reflection of what is happening or what has happened. If I actually wanted a lot of money, I can be honest with you, Ayen, I would be in the Republic of Uganda, where I was born, where I come from. I was in a position, given my pedigree, where I could have had an incredibly terrific opportunity to serve under President Yoweri Museveni. And I would be earning a lot of money. I would be happy.